Everyone is talking about the fifth dimension. You've seen the posts, the reels, the spiritual coaches promising you ascension through breathwork and moon rituals, and somewhere deep in you, you believe it's real. You feel it. This pull towards something larger than your current life. This quiet knowing that you are capable of an existence you haven't fully lived yet. But here's what nobody tells you. The way it's being sold to you is wrong. Not the destination is real, but the map is a lie. They're packaging the most terrifying threshold a human being can cross into a lifestyle aesthetic, a morning routine, a vibration playlist, a $97 course, and in doing so, they've stolen something sacred from you, the truth of what this crossing actually costs. What you're about to discover is older than any wellness brand. It has no logo. Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to warn the modern world about it, and the wisest traditions of human civilization understood it centuries before psychology had a name for it. The crossing into the fifth dimension is not an ascension, it is a dissolution. There are 7 signs that tell you it has already begun. Most people experience these signs and run. They call them breakdowns. They medicate them. They rebrand them as burnout and book a vacation. But you're here, which means something in you already suspects the truth. These aren't problems to solve. They are the threshold announcing itself. Jung called it individuation, the process by which a human being becomes, fully and without apology, who they actually are, not who their parents needed, not who their culture rewarded, the real self, the whole self. Here is the reframe that changes everything. What people think is true. Awakening is an upgrade. You take the person you already are, add better habits, raise your frequency, expand your vocabulary, and you become more conscious. Same person, better version. That is wrong. Precisely and uncomfortably wrong. The self you've been protecting, polishing, and presenting to the world, the one you call I, is not your real self. It is your constructed self, built by a child who needed to belong, reinforced by a teenager who needed to survive, perfected by an adult who needed to appear worthy. What's actually true is that the crossing requires that constructed self to die, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The version of you running the show, making your decisions, choosing your relationships, narrating your inner world, loses its grip. And from the inside, that process does not feel like a sunrise. It feels like collapse. What this costs you to accept is everything you've mistaken for growth, every spiritual identity you've built, every boundary you've labeled as healing, every piece of self-awareness you've quietly used to feel ahead of the people around you. The crossing costs you the story of the person doing the crossing. That is the price of the fifth dimension. And the 7 signs you're about to discover, they are that price, arriving at your door one by one. Everyone who has ever crossed this threshold has noticed the first sign in the same quiet, unsettling way. Your old life begins to feel like a costume you can no longer wear. You wake up inside the same life, same relationships, same career, same apartment, same morning coffee, and something is fundamentally off, not dramatically off, not crisis level off, quietly, persistently, uncomfortably off, like wearing clothes that fit perfectly last year and now feel like they belong to someone else entirely. You perform your routines, you say your lines, you show up to everything you're supposed to show up to. But there is a growing distance between you and the character you're playing, a glass wall between you and your own existence. Jung called this the emergence of the self pressing against the persona. The persona is the mask, the socially functional version of you that learned how to be acceptable, likable, successful, safe. And for most of your life, you believed the mask was your face. You identified with it completely. But the deeper psyche has its own intelligence, and at a certain point, it refuses to keep pretending. Ancient wisdom has always known this moment. Scholars of the human soul discovered centuries ago that there comes a point in every person's journey where the life they have been living begins to feel hollow, not because the life was wrong, but because the soul has outgrown the shell it was hiding inside. This was never treated as a problem. It was treated as the beginning of the only journey that actually matters. You feel it as dissonance. You might label it burnout or depression or existential restlessness. You try to fix it by changing external things, the job, the city, the relationship, but it follows you. Because the problem was never the life. The problem is that the version of you who built that life no longer exists. And the new one hasn't fully arrived yet. You are standing in the gap. And the gap is terrifying. You'll know you're moving through this sign when you stop trying to fix the dissonance and start asking what it's pointing toward. When the question shifts from what's wrong with my life to who am I becoming, when you stop running from the hollow feeling and sit inside it long enough to hear what it's saying. That shift, quiet as it is the first footfall across the threshold. The second sign is harder to admit because it doesn't look like a spiritual awakening. It looks like a problem with your personality. You stop being able to pretend you care about things you don't care about. Not in a dramatic, burning bridges way, in a slow, undeniable way. Conversations that used to fill you now drain you completely. Social obligations that used to feel normal now feel like a performance you've forgotten the script to. You sit in rooms full of people talking about things that everyone around you seems to find important, and you feel nothing. Not superiority, not judgment, just a vast, quiet absence of investment. And this frightens you because you were never this person. You used to be engaged, you used to care, and now you wonder if something is wrong with you. If you've become cold or arrogant or broken in some way you can't name. Jung understood this precisely. He called it the withdrawal of projections. The moment when the psyche stops investing its energy in external performances and begins pulling that energy inward toward the real work, the energy that used to go into maintaining appearances, into managing how you're perceived, into keeping up with the social theater, that energy is being redirected, not wasted, redirected. The oldest recorded traditions observe that when a person begins their true inward journey, the world of appearances loses its grip on them. What once seemed urgent becomes trivial. What once seemed essential becomes hollow. This was understood not as detachment from life, but as the first movement toward a deeper one. You'll know you're moving through this sign when you stop apologizing for what no longer holds your attention. When you understand that the withdrawal isn't emptiness, it's preparation. When you realize that the energy you're no longer spending on performance is quietly accumulating into something that hasn't revealed itself yet. Something is being saved. For what? You don't yet know, but it's being saved. You're 2 signs in, and if you've recognized yourself in either of them, what comes next is where most people tap out. Not because the ideas get more complex, because they get more personal. If this video is landing for you, if something in what you're hearing is cracking something open, then before we go further, take a second and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, because what's coming in the rest of this video is the kind of content that most platforms actively suppress. The sign that you want more of this is the most important click you'll make today. Now let's keep going. The third sign is the one that makes you question your own sanity. Your relationship with time begins to collapse, not in a poetic way, in a visceral, disorienting way. You find yourself unable to care about the future the way you used to. The 5-year plan feels absurd. The goals you set feel like they belong to someone you used to be. And simultaneously, the past loses its weight. Old wounds that used to define you, that you used to carry like identity, begin to feel distant. Not healed necessarily, just strangely irrelevant, like reading someone else's diary. You exist increasingly only in the present moment, and this terrifies you because the present moment is where there are no stories to hide behind. Jung spent decades documenting what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's innate capacity to hold opposites simultaneously without collapsing into one of them. Past and future are how the constructed self maintains its coherence. The story of where you came from and where you're going is how the persona justifies its existence. When that story begins to dissolve, the ego experiences it as annihilation, because for the ego, losing the story is losing everything. Timeless spiritual thought has always known this. The wisest traditions of human civilization taught that the soul exists in a dimension where past and future are human constructions, useful for navigating the physical world, but ultimately illusions that keep consciousness trapped in a loop of memory and anticipation. The moment a person begins to slip free of that loop, they experience what looks like disorientation, but is actually the first taste of a different kind of existence entirely. You feel it as an inability to plan, as a strange indifference to outcomes that used to consume you. People around you might call it laziness, or avoidance, or depression. They are wrong. What is actually happening is that your consciousness is beginning to operate from a different coordinate in time, and the old coordinates no longer compute. You'll know you're moving through this sign when the present moment stops feeling like a waiting room and starts feeling like the only real place there is. When you stop measuring your worth by what you've achieved or what you're working toward. When you can sit inside a single moment without needing it to mean something beyond itself. That stillness, unfamiliar and slightly frightening as it is not emptiness. It is contact. Direct, unmediated contact with what you actually are beneath the story. The fourth sign is the one nobody posts about, because it doesn't photograph well. Your shadow begins to surface, and it is uglier than you expected. Parts of yourself you thought you had healed, or transcended, or processed, or prayed away, begin reappearing. Old rage, old jealousy, desires you've judged in other people and secretly carried in yourself. Patterns you swore you'd broken, showing up again in new relationships, new situations with a new face, but the same feeling underneath. And your first instinct is shame, because you thought you were further along than this. You thought the work you'd done counted for something. You thought the version of yourself that meditates and reads and reflects and grows was proof that you had moved past this. Jung's most important insight is the one that the entire modern wellness industry quietly ignores, is that the shadow cannot be outgrown. It can only be integrated. Every quality you have ever denied in yourself, every impulse you've suppressed, every part of your personality you deemed unacceptable and pushed into the dark, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground, and it runs your life from there. invisible and unopposed, while the conscious you takes the credit and the blame for outcomes you don't fully understand. Ancient wisdoms taught this with devastating clarity. Scholars of the human soul wrote centuries ago that the greatest enemy a person faces is not outside them. It is the self they refuse to look at. That the parts of yourself you flee from do not weaken with distance. They strengthen, and they will continue to govern your choices, your relationships, your reactions, until you turn and face them with honesty rather than horror. The crossing into a higher dimension of consciousness is not a movement away from your darkness. It is a movement through it. You do not ascend past your shadow. You descend into it. You own it. You integrate it. And only then, only after that terrifying act of radical self-honesty, does something genuinely new become possible. You'll know you're moving through this sign when you stop being shocked by your own darkness and start being curious about it. When you can look at your worst impulses without collapsing into self-hatred or spiritual bypassing. When you understand that the shadow surfacing isn't evidence of failure, it's evidence that the deeper self is finally strong enough to handle what the constructed self spent years hiding from. The ugliness arriving is not a setback. It is the material of your transformation presenting itself for integration, and you cannot cross without it. The fifth sign is the one that ends relationships, not dramatically, not with arguments or betrayals or clean story-worthy endings. It ends them with silence, with distance, with the slow, painful realization that certain people in your life were never really connected to you. They were connected to the version of you that no longer exists. You begin to feel profoundly alone in rooms full of people who love you. And this is perhaps the most disorienting sign of all, because the loneliness doesn't come from rejection. It comes from outgrowing. The people around you haven't done anything wrong. They are exactly who they've always been. But you are no longer exactly who you've always been. And the connection that used to feel natural now requires a performance you are no longer willing to give. Jung called this the necessary solitude of individuation. He observed, across decades of clinical work, that the person undergoing genuine psychological transformation almost always experiences a period of profound isolation, not because they become antisocial, but because authentic selfhood cannot be crowdsourced. The deeper self does not emerge in rooms where you are performing. It emerges in the silence where performance becomes impossible. The wisest traditions of human civilization understood this with a precision that modern culture has completely lost. They knew that certain crossings must be made alone, that the companionship which comforts you in the old life can become the very thing that prevents you from entering the new one, not because those people are bad, but because their familiarity with who you were makes it harder for you to become who you are. You feel this as guilt, as selfishness, as the fear that something is wrong with you, for needing distance from people who have done nothing wrong. You try to maintain the connections out of loyalty. You show up. You perform the closeness, but inside you are somewhere else entirely. And the effort of pretending otherwise is exhausting in a way that sleep cannot fix. You'll know you're moving through this sign when you stop interpreting the loneliness as evidence that something has gone wrong and start recognizing it as evidence that something is going right. When you understand that the people meant to walk with you into the next version of your life cannot find you until you stop hiding in the old one, when solitude stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like the only place honest enough to hold what you're becoming. The connections that survive this crossing will be the realest ones you've ever known. But first, you have to let the ones built on the old self quietly fall away. The sixth sign is subtle, and it is the one most likely to be mistaken for arrogance. You develop an almost unbearable sensitivity to inauthenticity in other people, in systems, in conversations, in the content you consume, the environments you enter, the words people say when they mean something entirely different. You begin to feel falseness the way some people feel a change in weather in your body before your mind has fully processed it, a tightening, a withdrawal, an instinctive recoil from anything that isn't real. And this creates problems because the world runs on inauthenticity, social niceties, professional performances, curated identities, polished surfaces. These are the operating system of consensus reality. And you used to run on that operating system too. You were fluent in it. You were good at it. But something has shifted in your perceptual architecture, and now falseness registers like a frequency you can no longer ignore. Jung described this as a consequence of confronting the shadow. Once you have faced your own inauthenticity with honesty, you develop an acute sensitivity to it in the world around you. The person who has looked at their own mask with clear eyes can no longer be fully fooled by the masks of others, not because they are better, but because they are more awake to the game everyone is playing. Ancient wisdom carried this observation for centuries. Scholars of the human soul wrote that the person who begins to see clearly pays a price for that clarity. The comfortable blindness that allowed them to move through the world without friction is gone. What was invisible becomes visible. What was tolerable becomes intolerable. This was never described as a gift without cost. The cost is real. The sensitivity is real. And learning to carry it without becoming bitter or isolated is itself part of the crossing. You'll know you're moving through this sign when your sensitivity to inauthenticity stops making you angry at the world and starts making you more rigorous about yourself. When you use the clarity not as a weapon pointed outward, but as a standard held inward. When you become less interested in identifying what is false in others and more committed to eliminating what is false in you. That inward turn is everything. It is the difference between awakening and arrogance, and it is a line you will have to consciously choose to stand on every single day. The seventh sign is the quietest one, and it is the one that tells you the crossing is nearly complete. You begin to want nothing that you cannot be. Not nothing in the nihilistic sense. You still have desires, preferences, directions you want to move in. But something has fundamentally shifted in the relationship between wanting and being. You no longer experience your desires as proof of your inadequacy, as evidence of the gap between who you are and who you need to become. You begin to want from fullness rather than from lack, from curiosity rather than from fear, from a genuine pull toward experience rather than a desperate attempt to fill something empty inside. Jung called this the integration of the self, the moment when the conscious ego stops fighting the deeper psyche and begins moving in the same direction as it. The wanting and the being align, and when they align, the quality of everything you pursue changes entirely. Your relationships change. Your work changes. The way you move through a day changes, not because your external circumstances have transformed, but because the one experiencing those circumstances has. The oldest recorded traditions spoke of this state, with a reverence that no modern vocabulary quite captures. They described it as the condition of a person who has returned to their original nature before the world told them who to be, before fear began making their decisions, before the constructed self built its fortress around the real one. A person in this state, the ancient teachers wrote, does not chase the world. The world arranges itself around them, not through magic, through alignment, through the radical coherence of a human being who is finally, completely, undividedly themselves. You'll know you're moving through this sign when the frantic quality of your ambition softens into something steadier, when you stop needing outcomes to validate your worth, when you can pursue something fully, give it everything, and release it without your identity collapsing if it doesn't arrive on your terms, when the wanting feels clean, when the being feels enough. That is the seventh sign, and if you have recognized yourself in even 3 or 4 of these, the crossing has already begun. Most people will watch this video and feel it deeply. They will feel seen, cracked open, briefly illuminated. They will sit with the discomfort for exactly as long as it takes to close the tab, and then they will return, quietly, automatically, without even noticing, to the constructed self that was waiting patiently for them the whole time. This is not a judgment, it is a pattern, and Jung documented it with the precision of someone who had watched it happen thousands of times across thousands of lives. He called it the regressive restoration of the persona, the psyche's instinct, when the crossing becomes too real, to retreat back into the familiar mask, to repackage the awakening as a story about awakening rather than allowing it to become an actual transformation. You will recognize this in yourself, the moment insight becomes identity. The moment you start describing your shadow work instead of doing it, the moment your awareness of these signs becomes a new layer of persona, the awakened one, the conscious one, the one who has seen through the illusion. This is the most sophisticated trap on the path, and it is the one that catches the most intelligent, most spiritually literate people of all. Ancient wisdom named this trap with devastating accuracy. Timeless spiritual texts have long warned that the greatest danger on the inward journey is not ignorance. It is the performance of knowledge, the person who speaks the language of transformation without submitting to its actual cost, who uses the vocabulary of dissolution to avoid the experience of it, who collects insights the way others collect possessions, as a defense against the very emptiness those insights are pointing toward. The crossing is not an intellectual event. It never was. It is a lived surrender, and surrender cannot be theorized. It cannot be optimized. It cannot be scheduled into a morning routine or captured in a journal entry that you reread to remind yourself how deep you are. It happens in the moments you cannot control, in the relationships that break you open against your will, in the silence that arrives when all your usual escapes have stopped working, in the darkness that does not lift on command. This is why most people do not complete the crossing, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack sincerity, but because at the exact moment the real cost presents itself, at the exact moment the constructed self is asked to genuinely release its grip, they choose comfort. They choose the familiar ache of the old self over the terrifying freedom of the new one, and they dress that choice in spiritual language so it doesn't feel like a retreat. You have to decide right now which kind of person you are going to be. Not the kind who understands this, the kind who lives it. Because here is what becomes possible when all 7 signs are met with surrender instead of resistance. Here is what is waiting on the other side of the dissolution. You stop reacting and begin responding. The hair-trigger defensiveness that used to govern your interactions, the way criticism sent you into spiral, the way uncertainty sent you into control, that loses its power, not because you become emotionally flat, because you become emotionally rooted. You feel everything, but you are no longer at the mercy of everything you feel. You operate from truth instead of approval. The exhausting calculation, what will they think? How will this land? Am I too much? Am I enough? Goes quiet. Not because you stop caring about people, because you stop needing their perception of you to tell you who you are. You become, for the first time, the authority on yourself. You attract from alignment instead of from hunger. The relationships, the opportunities, the experiences that begin entering your life carry a different quality entirely, because you are no longer pulling them from a place of lack. You are meeting them from a place of wholeness, and wholeness calls to wholeness in ways that hunger never could. You create from overflow instead of from fear. The work you produce, the contributions you make, the mark you leave, they stop being driven by the need to prove something and start being driven by the genuine abundance of what is moving through you. Creation becomes an act of giving rather than an act of grasping. You live in the present without apology. The past no longer owns you. The future no longer terrorizes you. You exist fully and without fragmentation in the only moment that has ever actually existed. And from that place, that single, steady, sovereign place, you discover that everything you were searching for in the accumulation, in the performance, in the endless becoming, was here the entire time. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not perfection, not the elimination of struggle, not the arrival at some final, untouchable state of enlightenment, but the integration of every part of yourself, the light and the shadow, the wound and the gift, the mask and the face beneath it, into a coherent, authentic, fully inhabited human life. The 5th dimension is not a place you travel to, it is a depth you travel into yourself, past the constructed self, past the shadow, past the stories and the performances and the carefully maintained image of who you need the world to believe you are. And what you find there, beneath all of it, is not what you feared. It is what you always were. Jung wrote near the end of his life that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not partially, not selectively, completely, with everything you've done and everything you've failed to do, with every darkness you carry and every light you've been afraid to claim. That complete acceptance, that radical, unflinching, total ownership of everything you are, is the crossing. Not the meditation, not the retreat, not the vocabulary, the acceptance. So here is your challenge: not to watch more videos, not to collect more insights, not to add this to the library of things you know but haven't yet lived. The challenge is this: identify the one sign, just one, that you recognized most uncomfortably in yourself today. And instead of thinking about it, instead of journaling about it, instead of discussing it with someone who will validate how aware you are, sit with it alone, in silence, without trying to fix it or reframe it or resolve it. Just let it be true, because the moment you can let the uncomfortable truth simply be true, without running, without performing, without spiritualizing it into something more palatable, that is the moment the crossing begins in earnest. Jung said it simply: He said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you've been performing, not who you've been building toward, not the elevated, optimized, high-frequency version of yourself that the wellness industry is selling you, who you actually are, right now, in this moment, with all of it intact. That person, unpolished, unsanitized, fully integrated, is the fifth dimension, and they have been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to stop pretending they don't exist.